Hello friends, welcome back to Sorry What. My name is Jason and I have another story for you today. Are you ready? Well, go grab a cup of your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let us begin. Yes, Mrs. Worthington, I understand. Yes, I couldn't agree more. Of course, Mrs. Worthington, I'll be sure to do that. Will this blue-haired old windbag ever shut up? Susan Morgan asked herself in frustration as she listened to the wife of the board chairman of the Birch Grove Mansion and Museum rattle on. But as the development director of Birch Grove, Susan knew she had no choice but to listen and agree with the old woman's pontificating. The younger woman wasn't inclined to suffer fools gladly, and she was particularly incensed when someone assumed they were smarter than her, simply because of their family wealth. I've had more than my fill of rich witches who thought their money made them authorities on other people's business, Susan snarled to herself. A glance at her watch only added to her frustration. She was late leaving for an important meeting. But just as Susan was about to interrupt, the old woman abruptly halted her monologue. Goodness, look at the time. If I don't hang up now, I'll be late for my hair appointment. I understand, Mrs. Worthington. Sorry to have kept you so long, Susan replied without a hint of sarcasm. After her caller had finally rung off, Susan quickly dashed off an IM to her husband. Dinner with the prospect. Don't wait up. When it was sent, she hastily tidied her desk, checked her makeup in a hand mirror, and then strode out the door of her small office. The space was originally a butler's pantry in the Birch Grove mansion, but at least it has my name on the door, she thought. As she started down the hallway, Evita, her Latina secretary, called after her, "Are you leaving, Senora Morgan?" Without slowing her stride, Susan looked back over her shoulder irritably. "I'm off to call on a prospective donor. I won't be back today." As Evita watched, she could see the rhythmic swivel of her boss's expensive suit skirt, and hear her high heels tapping on the mansion's marble floors. As soon as the woman was out the exit, Evita darted down the hallway toward the office of the executive director, stopping at his secretary's desk. "Is he gone?" she asked Christina. "See," Christina replied, "he left about 10 minutes ago. He said he had an important meeting to attend." Evita smirked, just like clockwork. This week, last week, the week before that, they both have meetings to go to at the same time. They think we don't know what's really going on. She looked toward the exit and spat out, "Pruder." The two young women snickered and went back to their work. Professor Daniel Morgan looked out over the array of faces in his intro to econ class. Although he knew only a few would have any lasting interest in economics, he hoped he could at least spark a little intellectual curiosity in the subject. To pique that interest would call for an unconventional approach. He clicked the icon on his tablet computer, and behind him a projected image of a graph filled the wall. "Today," he intoned, "we're going to talk about the concepts of supply, demand and price." Some comedian in the lecture hall gave a low groan, provoking general laughter. Daniel was unfazed. I know, boring. But those abstract concepts have real-world impact. Let me give you an example." He reached down and picked up a piece of artwork, holding it so they could all see. "Anybody recognize this?" he asked. "Marilyn Monroe, by Andy Warhol," a female voice spoke up. "Sorry, miss, I'm afraid you're in the wrong class. Art appreciation is in the other building," Daniel quipped. When the laughter died down, Daniel smiled. "Seriously, our art lover is exactly right. So why am I showing you an Andy Warhol in an econ class? The answer is that this very work, or at least one that looks almost exactly like it, sold in 2022 for slightly over $195 million. That makes it the current record holder for a sale by an American artist." There were a couple of whistles from the students. "I assume," Daniel went on, "that no one in this classroom was the buyer." That brought a few chuckles. "No billionaires here." "Well, I was hoping. Anyway, the fact is that at that price there was only one buyer for Andy's Marilyn. Yet any one of us could go over to the university bookstore right now and buy a reproduction of Marilyn for maybe $20. And why are there so many buyers at the bookstore and so few at the auction? It's the price. At $195 million, there was only a single buyer, but at $20 bucks, demand skyrockets. Before you start to disagree, I know there are many factors affecting market demand for any commodity, product or service. We'll get into those in upcoming classes. But the fact remains that price is one of, if not the most important, factor in determining demand. When the session ended, Daniel was pleased that a number of students came up to ask questions or argue a different point of view. "At least I got them thinking about the subject," he mused with satisfaction. When he returned to his office, he stowed the Monroe print away behind a file cabinet, and then fished his cell phone out of his pocket. He felt it vibrate during his lecture, but made it a rule never to interrupt class to check. Now he saw that Susan was going to be out again this evening. It bothered him that this seemed to be happening so often, but at least it gave him an opportunity to stop by and check on his dad. When Ezra had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease several years ago, the older man insisted he could manage perfectly well in his own home. But Daniel had seen his father's symptoms worsening, and his concern prompted him to visit more frequently. When he reached his dad on the phone, the older man launched into a rambling discourse on symptoms real and imagined, doctors who didn't know what they were doing, and the problems of the world in general. When Daniel finally managed to ask if it would be convenient for him to drop by, his father insisted he come and stay for dinner. Daniel tried to protest, but his father interrupted. "Here," he said, "talk to Paloma," and handed the phone away. Paloma was Ezra Morgan's live-in nurse and caretaker. When his dad's condition had visibly worsened, Daniel had insisted his father have full-time care if he wanted to remain at home. The old man had sullenly agreed, and promptly proceeded to run off every caregiver the agency sent with his complaints, insults, and hostile behavior. Just when Daniel had decided he would have no choice but to put his father in a nursing home, Paloma arrived. The young woman had two significant advantages over her predecessors. First, she was unexpectedly pretty, something that Ezra definitely appreciated. Second, Paloma was completely unfazed by Ezra's bluster. When he snapped at her, she snapped right back. When he balked at following a doctor's orders, she pestered him until he gave in and complied. And when he was grouchy and curt, she ignored him until he quit trying to fluster her. One day when Daniel had come by to see how things were going with the new caregiver, his father had surprised him by declaring that he approved of Paloma. "She doesn't take any sheep off me," he declared, and Daniel dared to hope they'd finally found a solution. Those hopes took a serious blow about 10 months later, when Paloma called Daniel to notify him she was going to quit. "It's my son, Marco," she told him. "My mother has been taking care of him, but now my abuela is sick, and Mama has to go live with her. Plus Marco is ready to start school, and there's just no way I can take care of him and Senor Morgan at the same time." If Daniel was upset at the news, Ezra simply refused to accept it. To Daniel's amazement, the old man came up with a solution. "Come and live here in my house," he told her. "This place is plenty big enough. Besides, you'll save on rent and your commute. I'll even kick in the groceries." "But what about Marco? You don't want a 6-year-old running through your house." "I've had a 6-year-old boy here before, you know. Besides, Marco will give me someone to talk to when I get tired of you nagging at me." She had gone to Daniel's office to talk to him about the proposal. Once he'd gotten over his surprise, he began to see the advantages. In addition to the continuity of care from someone his dad liked, Daniel thought that living in a family environment might be good for his father. "It's up to you, Paloma," Daniel had told her. "I think it could be a good arrangement for Dad, and I know I'd feel better if he's being cared for by someone he likes. But you have to decide if it would be good for you and Marco." "I believe it could work, Senor Daniel, but it would work better if you could try to come by more often, you know, for your dad's sake. And Marco would love it too." Then, to his astonishment, she blushed bright red before turning and scurrying out the door. Her reaction confused him, but he was delighted when he heard she'd accepted his father's offer. Now, after 18 months of the new arrangement, Daniel was not at all surprised to hear his dad deferring to Paloma's wishes, nor was he unhappy when she too urged him to stay for dinner. Given that the alternative was eating takeout alone at his campus home, Daniel didn't put up much resistance. In addition to her skills as a nurse, Paloma had turned out to be an excellent cook. "It'll be nice having a home-cooked meal for a change," he thought, his mood brightening. Susan hated the long drive through the countryside, but she knew it was necessary. Neither she nor Grant could afford to be recognized when they were developing prospects together. It wasn't just the length of the drive that bothered her, it was passing all the small, run-down houses along the way. "I used to live in a dump exactly like that one," she thought, and the memories came back to her again. Her father had abandoned the family when she and her sister were in grammar school. Her mother and the two daughters were forced to move into a rented shack her mother could barely afford on a maid's wages. The girls' classmates at school were a little better off, but that didn't stop them from picking on the two sisters mercilessly. But Susan had been intelligent. She'd made good grades all the way through high school, high enough to win her a full scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania. Education, she'd been taught, was the path out of poverty, the way to attain the same sort of lifestyle the other co-eds of up and all seemed to enjoy. And although those girls hadn't been unkind, there was no overlooking the socio-economic differences. While her classmates were dancing on the weekends at fraternity and sorority parties, Susan was in her dorm studying for Monday's tests. While they were spending their summers in Europe, she was working at a job on campus. Susan caught a break during her junior year, however, when she attracted the attention of a handsome economics teaching assistant. Daniel Morgan was well on his way to a doctorate, but he was no nerd. He had a good sense of humor and loved socializing. When he met her, he found Susan's combination of brains and beauty irresistible. There were rules against relationships between TAs and undergrads, but with Dominican and her in fine arts, the rules were easily overlooked. Susan had already dated a bit and explored a few sexual encounters. But she was determined to better herself, and knew a reputation as a campus slut was not a path to success. Now, faced with the prospect of a relationship with a man with a future, she did everything she could to seize it. He never had a chance. A man with a future, huh? She thought angrily. She'd expected Daniel to join one of the big investment banks or management consulting firms that regularly recruited on campus. When he told her his dreams lay in academia, she'd been quietly disappointed. But maybe he'd wind up heading a major institution, she consoled herself. Some quick research online reassured her that several university presidents had backgrounds in economics. But now, 7 years after they'd married, she found herself living in a nowhere university town with a husband contentedly teaching in a nowhere university. This isn't the future I wanted, she cursed. In this blighted environment, she landed a fundraising job for a local museum in a converted mansion formerly owned by one of Pennsylvania's oil barons. Once again, she found herself beholden to a clutch of wealthy matrons and their simpering offspring, listening to their gossip, jumping to their imperious demands. But it wouldn't be this way for long, she swore to herself as she steered her car behind the small rural motel where she and Grant met. I found a new path to climb. Before Daniel could get out of the car at his father's house, the front door flew open, and a small ball of boyish energy came flying toward him. Senor Daniel, will you play football with me? Marco yelled. Marco, Paloma yelled, stepping out onto the porch, leave Senor Daniel alone. He's been teaching all day and he's tired. Before the little boy's face could fall, Daniel waved his mother off. It's fine, Paloma. Come on, Marco, show me your skills. With that the two of them began to play, dribbling, passing and shooting the grass-stained soccer ball. As they tore around the yard, Daniel noticed that Paloma had gone inside and brought his father out to watch them. The old man was delighted with the action, cheering them on excitedly, even though he'd never been to a soccer game in his life. They finally stopped when Paloma called them in for dinner. Marco protested, but Daniel was just as happy to quit. I'm not in shape to keep up with that boy, especially playing soccer. Expecting traditional Latin American food, Daniel was pleasantly surprised when Paloma served a Mediterranean-style meal. Chicken kebab over basmati rice with a Greek salad and pita bread on the side. Ezra grumbled about wanting a hamburger, but Daniel noticed he cleaned his plate. They ate the meal like a family, talking about the day, their plans for the week, and other incidentals that lifted Daniel's spirits even more. He realized that he hadn't thought of Susan since he'd arrived. As they were clearing the plates, Paloma leaned over and whispered, in case you were wondering, I try to follow a Mediterranean diet with Senor Morgan when he'll let me. I want to protect his heart as much as possible. Thank you, Paloma. Whatever you're doing seems to be working. I haven't seen Dad this energized in a long time. After the dishes were in the dishwasher, they all moved into the den. After a little more conversation, Daniel noticed that Marco was growing quiet. I guess even 7-year-olds can tire out after playing so hard, he thought with amusement. Paloma noticed too, and led Marco to his room. By the time she had supervised her son's preparations for bed, he was already half asleep. But once he was down, his eyes flashed open again. Mama, can Senor Daniel come say goodnight? We don't want to impose on him, she said sternly, before relenting, but I'll ask. The boy's request pleased Daniel, and he readily followed Paloma back to Marco's bedside. To his surprise, the boy reached up and hugged him, then laid back down, rolled over and closed his eyes. Good night, Marco, Daniel said fondly, tucking the blanket around the boy's shoulder. Buenas noches. When the two got back to the den, Daniel saw that his father had also nodded off. He helped Paloma get him back to his bedroom and helped him into the bed. It startled Daniel to realize how little his father weighed. After the two of them returned to the den, Daniel thanked Paloma for the meal and told her he would head home. Would you stay a little longer? She asked, reaching for his arm before stopping herself. Can you tell me a little about the painting in the living room? Sure, he said, and followed her into the other room. There on the wall in the special frame was Andy Warhol's sage blue Marilyn Monroe. Shatterproof glass protected the frame, which was firmly bolted to the wall. Underneath the four corners of the frame were special pads sensitive to any change in pressure between the wall and the artwork. On the opposite wall, two small units emitted infrared beams, searching for anything coming too close to the work. I'm sure my dad has warned you about all the security, Daniel said, and Paloma nodded. That's why I won't allow Marco in here, she explained. One time he bounced his soccer ball against the wall, and in no time a security unit was here to investigate. She shook her head. We won't make that mistake again. But what I don't know is how your father came to have such a special painting. It's a good story. My grandfather was a printer in Germany before World War II. He escaped just before things got bad and came to America with only his name. Actually, he lost part of that as well. Some immigration clerk on Ellis Island changed Morgenston to Morgan. Anyway, my grandfather found work as a printer in New York City and brought his son, my dad, into the business to learn the trade. My father became interested in silkscreen printing, which was just becoming popular for artwork in the early 1960s. To make a long story short, he wound up working as an apprentice for the company that printed many of the silkscreens Andy Warhol created. Apparently, Warhol noticed my dad working late one night and took a liking to him. On impulse, he gave him that artist's proof on the wall and even signed a dedication on the back. That's quite a gift to someone Warhol hardly knew. I agree, but you have to remember that back then Warhol was selling his silkscreens for only a few $100s. He probably felt an artist's proof just wasn't that valuable. Anyway, it wasn't until later that Warhol's works began to skyrocket in value. But isn't it dangerous to keep it here? Not that many people know my dad has a Warhol, and it's never been appraised. But when that auction got so much publicity recently, we couldn't ignore the risk. That's when my dad got all the security measures put in. I wouldn't say they're foolproof, but as you and Marco learned, even touching the wall will bring a fast response from the security team. She looked at the painting again. I can understand why your father wants to keep it here. He must be very proud of it. He is, Daniel nodded, and I'm very proud of him. Paloma smiled and nodded. A little later, Daniel got into his car to return to the old Victorian-style home the university provided on campus. As he drove away, he looked back at the light coming through the windows in his father's house. I wish it was just as bright at my house, he sighed. Susan was gone often these days, and even when she was there, the atmosphere felt chilly. He shook his head and drove away. As Susan left the motel, she still felt the delicious sensations of postcoital bliss between her thighs. Nothing like a good duck to help a girl relax, she thought contentedly. And Grant Nicholson was a good duck, in no small part because he was well and truly smitten with her. His ardor practically oozed out of his pores, and when they were in bed he was desperately eager to bring her multiple loss. But as she left their shabby love nest, her thoughts drifted toward her husband. It's not that Daniel is a bad husband, and he certainly isn't a bad lover. But he just doesn't have the drive and ambition I need. Grant loves mingling with all those millionaires on the board, and he's good at it. Daniel is satisfied going to university parties and mixing with the other faculty. Every time I have to attend one of those things, I just want to scream. She gripped the steering wheel tighter. But as soon as his old man kicks off and Daniel gets his inheritance, I'll divorce him in a heartbeat. And once I get my half of the proceeds from the Warhol and the house, I'll have as much money as those rich witches, not to mention a high-profile husband. As she pulled into their driveway, her face twisted into a sneer. University housing. Well, I can stand this dump a little while longer, and my husband as well. The next time Daniel saw Paloma, she wasn't smiling. He just finished grading an exam when he heard a knock at his office door. Looking up, he was startled to see the young woman standing there, and the expression on her face filled him with alarm. What's wrong, Paloma? Has something happened to my dad? Is Marco okay? She hurried in, closing the door behind her, and sat down in one of his side chairs. Your dad is fine, Daniel. My mother is staying with him and Marco while I'm here. But, he shook his head impatiently. So what's wrong? What's going on? You know that I have a large family in this area, yes? I didn't, but go on. One of my sisters, Christina, works at Birch Grove. She is the secretary to Senor Nicholson, the executive director. Okay. Anyway, Christina sees Mrs. Morgan at the mansion every day. Yes, but, Daniel, I'm so sorry, but your wife and Senor Nicholson are having an affair. Her words hit him hard. His first instinct was to deny the possibility because he didn't want to believe it. But given the current state of relations with his wife, he immediately saw how an affair would explain what had been going on. Gaining control of himself, he leaned forward in his chair. How does your sister know this? He asked intently. Paloma looked miserable. We have a cousin who works as a maid in the Picono View Motel. It's north of here, about 20 miles en route. He waved his hand impatiently and she hurried on. Your wife and Senor Nicholson, they meet out there almost every week. The last time was 2 days ago, the night you had dinner with Senor Morgan, Marco and me. He ground his teeth, remembering that night and how late Susan had come to bed. But he kept his voice low and controlled. Paloma, this is very serious. I can't simply take the word of someone I've never met, even if she is your cousin. I know, but you don't have to take her word. Is it possible could you drive out there with me now? Half an hour later at the motel, Paloma was introducing Daniel to her cousin Lourdes, whose command of English was rudimentary. But with Paloma assisting with translation, the maid led the pair to a maintenance closet off the main hallway of the motel. She opened a door into the ventilation system and pulled out a recording system that had been hidden there. Daniel looked at Lourdes, then at Paloma. "How did this get here?" he growled. "Our family was together, and Christina was telling us her suspicions about Senor Nicholson and his frequent meetings with Senor Morgan. When she showed us a picture, Lourdes recognized them as the couple visiting the motel regularly." She looked at Daniel imploringly. "I'm sorry, Daniel, but I knew I had to find out the truth. I gave Lourdes the recorder. I hope you will not hate me for this." Daniel ignored her implied question. Instead, he pointed to the device. "Have you listened to this?" he demanded. She hung her head. "See, to part of it. Lourdes played it for me when she called me. That's when I knew I had to tell you." "All right," Daniel said grimly, "tell her to play the tape." When Lourdes hit the button with the arrow, all the volumes startled three of them. His wife's voice begging for more burst out of the small speaker. Lourdes quickly halted the playback, and then spoke to Paloma. "Do you want her to go back to the beginning?" Paloma asked Daniel. A pale-faced Daniel shook his head. "I don't know," I recognized Susan's voice. He rubbed his temples. "I really don't want to have to hear the whole damn thing. Let's just go on from here." The cousin fiddled with the volume control and then pressed play. At first they heard only some rustling of sheets and groan from the bed springs. A moment later, the lovers' conversation resumed. "God, Susan, you're amazing. I just can't get enough of you," came Grant Nicholson's voice admiringly. Then his tone grew almost urgent. "Honestly, baby, I don't want to wait any longer. Just say the word and I'll divorce my wife tomorrow. All I want is to be with you." "No," Susan's voice rang out sharply. "Don't you understand, Grant? We can't do anything until Daniel's old man passes. Once he's gone and Daniel inherits the Warhol, then I can divorce him. He'll have to auction it off as part of the settlement, and I'll get my half of the proceeds. After that, you can say goodbye to Greta and we'll finally be together." "Are you sure you can get half the Warhol? I thought inheritances were protected." The smirk on her face was evident in the sound of Susan's voice. "Don't worry about that. I've got a schuster who knows how to get around that. And since he gets paid based on the size of the settlement, I can guarantee you he's highly motivated." "Yeah, but how much longer do we have to wait?" Nicholson whined. "Be patient, baby," Susan reassured him. "The old man is going downhill fast. We'll get what we want soon enough." Daniel reached over and angrily stabbed the off button with his finger. What a conniving witch. She's got this whole thing figured out. He slammed his fist down on the counter, frightening the two women. Then he turned and walked out of the motel. Paloma hugged Lourdes quickly, then grabbed the recorder and hurried out to the parking lot. She found Daniel standing beside his car, staring off into space. He turned to her when she approached, and his eyes reflected both the anger and despair of a man betrayed. "I tried so hard, Paloma. I knew she wasn't happy with our marriage, but I kept trying to make things better." His expression darkened. "Now I know why nothing helped." Now his voice was filled with resolve. "Get in the car. We need to get back to town." She got into the passenger side, and, once they were on the road, timidly said, "I hope you're not angry with me, Daniel. I felt you would want to know what she was doing." He shook his head from side to side. "I'm not mad at you, Paloma, but I'm very angry at Susan." "What are you going to do? You're not going to hurt her, are you?" He glanced over at her. "Yes, I'm going to hurt her, and Nicholson as well." Seeing her expression, he added, "But not like you're imagining. I'm not a violent man, but I guarantee you they won't like what happens any better." She reached over to take his arm. "I don't want you to get into any trouble, Daniel. I just couldn't." He gave her a small smile. "Don't worry, Paloma, everything is going to work out okay." Then his smile disappeared. "Will you sort out your mother and Marco? I need to talk to my dad." He shook his head sadly. "He was so excited when I married Susan. He was very impressed with her, and couldn't wait for us to have children. When he hears what I've learned, he'll be as upset as I am." He glanced over at Paloma with a wry expression. "It's ironic, you know. I would get so frustrated every time Susan said she wasn't ready to start a family. But now I'm really glad we didn't." They drove the rest of the way in silence, each deep in thought. The conversation with his father was long and painful, but the two men finally came away with a plan of action. Daniel's first step was to file for divorce to short-circuit Susan's plan. His dad promised to ask his own attorney to recommend a divorce lawyer. He also cautioned his son to avoid saying or doing anything that might clue Susan in on what he'd learned. "I can do that, Dad," Daniel agreed. "I'll just avoid her as much as possible until I'm ready to have her served." Given how little time we spend with each other already, that shouldn't be too hard. To hide his feelings, Daniel spent much of the weekend on campus, grading papers, updating lesson plans, and generally trying to ensure his academic life wouldn't be too disrupted by the divorce to come. When his dad called him on Monday with a referral, Daniel immediately contacted the attorney's office to set up an appointment. But he was disappointed to learn that he couldn't see the woman until Thursday. He thought about searching for another attorney on the web, but then thought better of it. If Susan is going to try to pull some sort of legal shenanigans, I need someone really good in my corner. I can tough it out a little longer. When Thursday finally came, Daniel was gratified that he'd been patient. His new attorney seemed competent and confident. I think I know what your wife is planning, but I really don't think you have to worry about your father's painting, the woman reassured him. As long as we file promptly, there's no way the Warhol will become part of any property settlement. She promised she would have his suit ready to file the following week, and could have the writ ready to be served later that same day. Almost there, Daniel thought as he headed back to his office on campus. And with any luck, we'll take care of Mr. Grant Nicholson as well. For the first time since he'd learned of Susan's treachery, he felt himself relax a little. The call he got on Sunday shattered his complacency. When he answered, he heard nothing at first except the woman sobbing. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I tried so hard to help him, I really did." Icy dread seized his heart. "Help you, Paloma? What's happened?" "It's Senor Morgan," she cried, then paused. "I have to go, the EMTs are here." The line went dead. Jumping to his feet, Daniel ran to his car and sped to his father's house. He found the street blocked by a fire truck, an ambulance and another truck from the fire department. Parking down the street, he ran toward the house, arriving just in time to see the EMTs wheel a gurney out onto the front porch. "Is he okay?" he asked frantically. The tech looked at him. "Are you the son?" Yes, I am." "Is he alive?" The man slowly shook his head. "I'm sorry, there was nothing we could do. He was gone when we got here." His heart had stopped beating. It looked like he'd had a massive stroke or an aneurysm. "But what about defibrillation? Could that help?" The man looked at him sympathetically. "I'm sorry, sir, but even if we could restart his heart, there'd be nothing else working, you understand. You wouldn't want that, and neither would he." As they loaded the gurney into the ambulance and drove slowly away, Daniel could only stand there in shock. Finally, he forced himself to trudge into the house. When Paloma saw him, she ran to him and threw herself sobbing into his arms. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I tried so hard to bring him back. I did chest compressions until the medics arrived, but it wasn't enough. I'm so sorry." Through his own tears, he held her away from him so he could look in her face. "It's not your fault, Paloma. You did everything you could. I talked with the EMT outside. He told me Dad must have had a stroke or cerebral aneurysm. He was probably gone before you even got to him." She lowered her head to Daniel's chest and continued to sob. "He was sitting at the table chatting with me. All of a sudden he grabbed his head and told me it hurt. Then he just toppled over and fell to the floor. Oh, Daniel, it was horrible." He gently led the distraught woman over to a chair to sit down, then went to get water for both of them. When he returned, he asked, "Where's Marco?" "Marco. Madre de Dios, I almost forgot. He's at school. I've got to go get him." She began weeping again. "Marco will be so upset. He really loved your father." She hurried away, leaving Daniel alone in the suddenly empty house. He sat there for a long time, grief clouding his efforts to comprehend how suddenly his life had changed. He'd known his father was dying, but he wasn't prepared to lose him so soon. His own tears flowed again, and there was no one to comfort him. Finally, he compassed himself enough to start a list of people who needed to be notified and the tasks he needed to complete. Once he jotted down everything he could think of, he started the sorrowful task of making phone calls. After he'd reached or left messages for the most urgent group, Daniel locked up his father's house and drove over to Birch Grove to perform the task he'd left for last. As much as he hated the thought, he had decided to give Susan the news in person. "I want to see how she reacts," he thought bitterly. She was startled to see him walk into her little office, and when she heard the news, she said all the right things and displayed the appropriate grief. But as he watched her, he had to bite his tongue to keep from lashing out in anger. "Those are crocodile tears," he raged to himself. She must be absolutely delighted because now she can move ahead with her scheme. But he managed to keep himself in check until he left. The minute he was gone, Susan dashed out of her office, almost skipping as she ran down the hall to tell Grant Nicholson the news. Grant was startled by Susan's sudden appearance and caught off guard by the news she blurted out. Automatically he started to offer condolences, but she interrupted him. "Don't you see? This is good news. It's what we've been waiting for. With the old man gone, his estate now goes to Daniel." I can file for divorce, resolve the property settlement, and once it's final, you and I can be together. Grant felt his own excitement matching hers. I can't believe the waiting is over. So when do you plan to file for divorce? She thought for a moment. I don't want to come across as heartless. I'll wait until after his father is buried and a memorial service is over before I file. That makes sense, Grant acknowledged, but don't wait too long. Remember, it's likely to take a while for me to work things out with Greta. The next few days for Daniel were filled with all the mournful duties a death entails. His first and most pressing responsibility was his father's funeral. Even though his dad hadn't been observant, he'd left instructions that he wanted to be buried following the Jewish tradition. That meant organizing the interment for the following day. Once arrangements for his father's interment were made, Daniel began organizing a memorial service for the friends and neighbors who couldn't attend the burial. He had no other living relatives, but Ezra had made many friends over his career, and now they came to pay their last respects. Likewise, Daniel's friends and colleagues came to extend their condolences and support. Seeing so many people in attendance gave him some consolation. Both the interment and the memorial service were hard on Daniel, not only because of the grief he felt, but also because he was forced to attend both with Susan. As she had before, she played the grieving wife perfectly. But Daniel knew what her true thoughts were, and his anger morphed into bitter hatred. During all this, Daniel's new attorney had called to ask for instructions on Daniel's divorce filing. Given the host of responsibilities he faced, Daniel asked her to put his divorce on hold. "I'll have to get back to you," he told her. "My life is pretty crazy right now." After the memorial service concluded, a new and unexpected complication arose. Back at his father's house, Paloma asked him when he wanted Marco and her to move out. Daniel was aghast. "You can't leave, Paloma. In the first place, you have no place to go, and I have no intention of kicking you out on the street. For that matter, if the house sits vacant, it will become a target for thieves or vandals. Besides, if you go somewhere else, it will likely mean moving Marco to a new school. He's doing well where he is. I don't want to risk messing that up. You have to stay, at least for a while." She gratefully accepted, fully aware that Daniel's kindness and concern were a greater factor than the reasons he gave. With his father buried and the services complete, Daniel next contacted his father's attorney to learn what had to be done in conjunction with handling his father's estate. The list of steps he would have to take in conjunction with the probate process was a lengthy one. When he'd finished reviewing them with Daniel, the attorney had added an unexpected duty. Ezra, the attorney informed Daniel, had requested the reading of his will be held as soon as possible, before it even went to probate. Moreover, his father had left a list of people to be invited. When he heard the list, Daniel understood. "I have one request," he told the family attorney. "To make the reading of the will as formal as possible, can we hold it in your law office? If it's held there and your office issues the invitations, I think it's more likely that everyone who's supposed to be there will come." The old man readily agreed. On the appointed day of the reading, Daniel and Susan arrived at the attorney's office separately. As they took their seats around the small conference table in the law library, they greeted each other with strained cordiality. Except for the services for his father, the two of them had spent very little time together. Now, despite her outward calm, Daniel could tell his wife was almost bubbling over with excitement. He, on the other hand, was calm and composed. Minutes later, Paloma came in and introduced herself to the attorney. Susan stared at her, then leaned over to Daniel and demanded angrily, "What's she doing here?" He stared at her without emotion. She was invited. Before Susan could respond, she was startled to see Grant Nicholson enter. "You were invited too?" she asked. He nodded. "I'm not sure why, but the invitation was quite clear." Just then the attorney arose and pointedly cleared his throat. "May I have your attention, please? It appears that everyone who was invited is present. The late Mr. Morgan expressly wished that each of you be here for the reading of his last will and testament," he said in a sonorous voice. "I won't try your patience with a full reading of all the legal details of his will. Instead, Mr. Morgan wished that I, as he put it, cut to the chase." He cleared his throat. First, the late Mr. Morgan designated Daniel Morgan, his only child, as the executor of his will. It will be Daniel's responsibility to ensure that any taxes owed are paid, and any outstanding debts or other obligations are settled. Once those matters are properly dealt with, he will oversee the disposition of the estate's assets, according to the stipulations and wishes of his father. Daniel has agreed to serve in this capacity, and, I am informed, has already begun the process of resolving the estate's debts, taxes and other obligations. Susan shot a quick glance at Grant, giving him a brief smile of anticipation. "That brings us to the disbursement of the assets," the attorney continued. "The first request concerns Mr. Morgan's home in which he lived the last 27 years of his life, along with the lot on which it resides. His will reads, I hereby leave my home and grounds to Paloma Contreras, in gratitude for the long service she has done me in my time of illness and need. I also leave whatever funds remain in my checking account to help her pay the bills. What? Susan cried out in surprise. How can he give his house to that maid? It should go to Daniel. Yes, you are right, Paloma chimed in, recovering from her surprise. It should go to Daniel, not me. She looked over to Daniel for support, but he would not return her glance. Be that as it may, the attorney continued, the late Mr. Morgan was very clear as to his wishes. Now, if I may continue to the second bequest. When the group had quieted, the attorney resumed. The second bequest concerns the Andy Warhol hanging in my living room. I hereby leave the Warhol to the Birch Grove Mansion and Museum to become part of its permanent collection. Oh my God, Nicholson gasped. No, that's all wrong. Susan shouted. He can't do that, he was supposed to leave the Warhol to Daniel. I'm sorry, Mrs. Morgan, but Mr. Morgan expressly bequeathed the Warhol to Birch Grove, the attorney intoned. He wishes it to be hung in a place of prominence in the museum. But that means that Daniel gets nothing. Susan yelped. His father cut him out of the will. How could he do that? It's not right. Ladies and gentlemen, the attorney said in a loud voice, if I may have your attention, I have not finished reading the terms of the bequest. Please be advised that the second bequest Mr. Morgan made is conditional. The will goes on, my gift to Birch Grove is contingent upon the completion of two requirements. First, Birch Grove must immediately and permanently sever any and all professional relationships with Mrs. Susan Morgan. Second, Mr. Grant Nicholson, the executive director of Birch Grove, must immediately and permanently terminate the liaison he has been conducting with Mrs. Susan Morgan. In the event that either of these two requirements is not fully met, ownership of the Warhol is instead to go to the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. He pointed at Grant Nicholson. In case you're wondering, sir, I have sent notice of this conditional bequest to Pittsburgh just prior to this meeting. It is my understanding the Warhol Museum will be monitoring your compliance with these requirements most closely. This is ridiculous. Susan shrieked. That meddlesome old man has no say in our personal lives. She turned to Daniel. This is all you're doing, isn't it? You're trying to cheat me out of what's legally mine. I would never do that, Susan. In fact, I have what's legally yours right here. With that he handed her the envelope he'd brought with him to the meeting. She ripped it open and stared at the contents as though they were written in Greek. What is this? That's your legal notice that I've filed for divorce, he said. Then, taking out his iPhone and snapping a photo to document his action, he said grimly, Susan Morgan, you have now been served. You bastard, you can't divorce me, I'm divorcing you. She screamed. Daniel only smiled. While she was shouting, Susan hadn't noticed that Grant had quietly slipped out of the room. When she finally realized he was gone, she hurried after him. Meanwhile, Paloma was trying to argue with Daniel. This isn't right, Daniel. Senor Morgan should have left his house to you, not to me. You're his son, it's not right that you have nothing. Now Daniel smiled. Paloma, it's all right. My dad and I discussed this. He loved you and Marco, and wanted to make sure you were taken care of when he was gone. He knew I understood and that this was what I wanted too. He took her by the shoulders and looked at her carefully. Don't you see? He was a gruff old-fashioned man who had a hard time expressing his feelings. He didn't know how to say how much he appreciated the care you gave, the companionship you provided, and the way you didn't take any crap off him. This was his way of expressing his love. She wiped away fresh tears. Marco and I, we loved him too, Daniel. Susan literally ran down the hallway at Birch Grove to Grant's office. Ignoring his secretary, she barged into her boss's office. Grant, she panted, this is wonderful news. With the Warhol added to its collection, Birch Grove will draw a host of new visitors. You'll be head of the most prestigious art museum in the area. Thank you, Susan, he replied carefully. I think you're right. And after everything settles down, she went on, our relationship won't have to be secret anymore, just like you've always wanted. His countenance narrowed. Didn't you hear the qualification the old man's will added to his bequest? He asked sharply. That can't possibly be legally binding, she shot back. It will make for good gossip among the country club set, but it will blow over quickly. Except for the Warhol Museum, he countered. They would love to add such an important piece to their collection, so they'll be watching us with very sharp eyes. The catch in her voice betrayed her fear. But like I said, that can't be legal. No court would enforce such a requirement. Now Grant grew angry. Do you really expect Birch Grove to go to court with the Warhol Museum? Do you know what kind of resources they have? There's Carnegie Foundation money behind them. If they sue, the legal fees could bankrupt us. He stood up and handed his former lover a set of papers. I'm sorry, Susan, but I've already spoken with Mr. Worthington about this. As of today, you are no longer an employee of Birch Grove. Grant, you can't do that, not after all we've meant to each other. Then her tone grew shriller. Besides, you don't want me to tell your wife about us. I've already confessed to her, he told Susan coldly, and as soon as I'm done here I'm going home to resume groveling. Hopefully, the prestige of being the wife of the executive director of Birch Grove will soothe her hurt feelings. Now, it's time you leave the mansion. We'll arrange to have your severance check mailed to you. She stood there staring at him angrily, her fists clenched at her side. Instinctively, he took a half step back, fearing she might attack him. Instead, she spun on her heel and stalked away, heading down the hall to her former office. Quickly she grabbed a few personal items and then walked out. As she passed her secretary's desk, Evita asked, "Are you leaving, Mrs. Morgan?" "Yes," Susan answered, not even looking at her. As her heels clicked on the marble, Evita called after her, "Adios, Pruda." Then she hurried down to Christina's desk to tell her what had just happened. Daniel was prowling through the refrigerator looking for dinner when he heard the sound of keys in the front door. Stepping into the living area, he saw Susan enter, a sullen look on her face. When she saw her soon-to-be ex-husband, her expression turned to anger. "This was all you're doing, wasn't it? How long have you known about Grant and me?" "Long enough to blow up your little scheme," he shot back. "So you got Ezra to change his will," she said bitterly. "He was going to leave everything to you, and you talked him into changing it. Why would you do that?" "Because I wanted to make damn sure you'd never get your hands on it, no matter what happened. When I heard you and your lawyer had some scheme to get the Warhol declared community property, donating it to Birch Grove ensured that couldn't happen. Plus, it gave me the leverage to crush your little affair with Grant. I figured his love would vanish pretty quickly if it was a choice between you or the Warhol. So you really hate me that much?" He looked at her incredulously. "After what you tried to do? You're damned right," he shouted. She stared at him, shocked to see him so angry. After a moment he regained control. "There is one thing I want to know. Did you ever love me?" She sighed and flopped down in an armchair. "I think I did early on, back when we first got married. You were so dynamic, so full of potential. I thought you'd climb the ladder and take me with you." She shook her head, a bitter expression curling her lips. "Imagine my disappointment when I saw the path you chose instead. It wasn't long after that I started looking for a better opportunity. So it's always been about money and prestige with you. Love and a good life weren't enough." "How very Norman Rockwell of you," she smirked. "Don't you know? That's what losers choose when they don't have what it takes to win. Family, friends, community, that's your idea of losing. What I want is respect, the kind that money and position get you. That's what matters. The rest is just window dressing." He started to argue, then decided it wasn't worth it. "So what happens next?" Her bravado had evaporated. "I'm leaving. Thanks to you, my reputation in this town is trash. As soon as I can pack what I need, I'll be gone. And don't worry. Assuming we split assets equitably, I won't fight the divorce. All I want is half our savings and half the proceeds from the house." "Sorry, Susan, you're forgetting we don't own this house. It belongs to the university." She ground her teeth. "You always were so smart. Why couldn't you have been more ambitious?" Without waiting for an answer, she went to the bedroom. After a while she emerged with a suitcase, garment bag and cosmetics kit. "I'm leaving now," she told him. "I'll have my attorney contact yours, and we'll get the divorce done as quickly as possible." She gave him a baleful look. "At least we agree on one thing. We both want this marriage over with." He looked at her curiously. "So where are you going?" "As far away from here as I can, somewhere where I can start over, hopefully with someone a little more aggressive." Daniel watched her go. Good riddance, he thought with satisfaction. For once Susan proved as good as her word, and their divorce moved forward smoothly. Daniel hated having to pay alimony, but with his soon-to-be ex-wife now unemployed, he could hardly argue. It's a small price to pay to be rid of her, and even smaller when you consider what she was trying to do to you, his attorney advised him. In the meantime, serving as executor of his father's estate was keeping Daniel busy. Every day it seemed there was another requirement. Distributing copies of the death certificate, stopping his father's social security, notifying the IRS and filing a final 1040, posting legal notices with creditors and more. After classes, Daniel regularly found himself at his father's house, going through possessions squirreled away over the years, paying bills and sorting out his father's financial affairs. To his dismay, he discovered that his dad had paid everything with paper checks. Until he could get accounts switched to electronic payment, Daniel found himself writing more checks in a few weeks than he had in several years. Although the task was time-consuming, it did give Daniel the opportunity to work in the company of Paloma and Marco. His house on campus seemed dark and gloomy. His father's home felt alive with light and life. It was not uncommon for him to work into the evening and to have dinner with the two of them. He felt guilty about imposing, but Paloma begged him to stay. Even after he was nearly finished straightening out his father's affairs, she implored him to continue to eat with them. It is hard to cook for just the two of us, she maintained, and he was happy to yield to her request. Being part of a family, he found, was good medicine to heal the sorrow of his father's loss and the bitterness of the end of his marriage. A few weeks later, Daniel received a call from his father's attorney. The probate court has signed off on the final accounting of your father's estate. You're now free to dispose of his assets as he directed. Really? I thought probate usually took months. The old man chuckled. Normally, you'd be right, but your father's will seems to have been bumped up to the head of the list. Of course, that may have something to do with the number of movers and shakers serving on the Birch Grove board. It seems they're eager to get their hands on their new prize. In any case, you can move forward now. An hour after he'd heard from the attorney, Daniel got a call from Grant Nicholson inquiring when Birch Grove could expect to take possession of the Warhol. As I think you're aware, the museum and I have fully complied with the terms of your father's will. And now that it's cleared probate, we're obviously eager to proceed with the transfer. Although the legal impediments had been dealt with, a new complication arose. The museum curator insisted on having her own people box up and transport the silkscreen to Birch Grove. But the handover needed to be coordinated with the security company, which had to carefully disconnect all the protective devices and systems. Safely removing the work and decommissioning the various systems was a complex task. It would take most of the day for the two groups to effect the transfer. As he waited for progress reports in his office, Nicholson felt like a kid on Christmas Eve. By tomorrow morning, the most valuable artwork Birch Grove had ever owned would be in their possession. To celebrate the event, the museum was holding a private showing for the board of directors and special guests the following evening. The awkwardness of his affair with Susan was in the rear-view mirror. Ahead, the future for the museum and its executive director looked bright indeed. After arranging with the security company to protect his father's house while the transfer of the Warhol was being made, Daniel took Paloma and Marco on a day trip to the Poconos. The three of them went hiking on a scenic trail, had lunch at the Flagstaff Lodge, and rode the Lehigh Gorge Scenic Railway. By the time they got home, everyone except a guard from the security company had gone. The living room had been cleaned and the furniture put back where it belonged. Nevertheless, the smiling posterized face of Marilyn Monroe was missing, and all three of them felt its absence. Trying to break the somber mood, Daniel had a brainstorm. It's too late to cook dinner. How about I order some pizza? The suggestion was well received, and soon the three of them were sharing several large pieces. By the time they were finished, the combination of the heavy meal and the day's activities had worn them all out. Marco was already asleep, and Daniel carried him off to bed. Then, as he started for the front door, Paloma stopped him. Please, Daniel, stay here tonight. With all the security systems gone, I'd feel safer. You can sleep in your dad's room. He tried to demur, but she persisted, and after the long day he didn't feel like arguing. So when Paloma went off to her room to sleep, she hadn't moved after Senor Morgan's passing. Daniel stripped down to his t-shirt and boxer briefs, and lay down in his father's bed. At first, memories and the unfamiliarity of the bed kept him awake. But he must have been more comfortable than he thought, because he quickly dropped off to sleep. Sometime later, however, he was awakened by a sound in the hallway. As he sat up in bed, wondering if it was his imagination, he heard it again. Suddenly he saw the shadowy figure of Paloma open the door, tiptoe over to his bedside and slip under the covers. He started to speak, but she slid her soft hand over his mouth. Please, Daniel, it's been so long for me, and I've been so lonely. Then she removed her hand and replaced it with her lips. In an instant his objections were forgotten, and he returned her kiss with a passion that overwhelmed them both. The next evening was the celebration of the Warhol installation at Birch Grove. Grant Nicholson had arrived early, leaving his wife to come separately. The better for you to make a grand entrance, he told her. As he was going over the checklist for the festivities, he was startled by a knock on his office doorframe. Looking up, he saw the troubled face of the museum's curator. What is it? He demanded impatiently. Sir, there's something wrong with the Warhol, the woman said uneasily. What? It's not damaged, is it? No sir, nothing like that. It's just that it doesn't look quite right. Doesn't look right, what are you talking about? It's just that some of the colors don't look like they should. It's an artist's proof, Nicholson exploded. It's not supposed to look perfect. The curator winced but held her ground. And Warhol's signature, sir, it's not faded like it should be. I mean, he would have signed it back in the 60s, the ink should have faded. Is that what's troubling you? How do you know what kind of ink Warhol used? Go back and make sure everything is ready. The guests will be arriving any minute. The little woman didn't budge. But that's not the main thing, sir. The problem is, well, it's the wrong size. What? Yes, sir. Warhol's Marilyn Monroe is 36 by 36 inches. I looked it up to be sure. A proof would have to be the same size. But this print is only 35 inches square. Worthington's mouth fell open. So what are you saying exactly? The curator looked as though she were about to cry. Sir, this print is a fake, a forgery. There's no way it's authentic. Oh my God. The museum director cried, slumping back in his chair as tried to comprehend the full horror of her revelation. You're sure? He asked desperately. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. He stared off silently into the distance, stunned at what was happening. Sir, the curator interrupted anxiously. What do you want us to do? Should we go ahead and hang it anyway? Are you crazy? Nicholson shouted, causing the woman to flinch. If people found out we'd knowingly hung a fake work of art, it would mean the end of Birch Grove. He shuddered and then pointed at the curator. Take the work down and hide it. Tell your people to turn out the lights and put up a sign that says event cancelled. When the woman hesitated, Nicholson yelled, do it now before it's too late. The curator scurried off, and Nicholson slumped back, contemplating the disaster that had befallen him. A thought occurred to him, and he rushed out to his secretary's desk. Call the guard at the front entrance and tell him to chain the main gate shut. Quickly. She paused fearfully. What should I tell him to say to the guests? Just say the event has been cancelled due to an emergency, nothing more. Now hurry. Oh, and no more phone calls, understood. The frightened young woman nodded, but before she could pick up her phone, it began to ring. Sir, she said, it's the curator again. Do you want to talk to her? What does she want now? He asked rhetorically, while the secretary sat waiting nervously. All right, I'll take it in my office. You call the gate on the other line and make sure no one else gets in, he ordered. Back at his desk, Nicholson picked up the phone, and the curator began to babble. It's the caterer, sir. He wants to know what to do with the food you ordered. Tell him to take it back, Nicholson exploded. We sure as hell don't need it. I already tried that, sir, but he says he can't. It's already been spread out on the tables. He says it's illegal for him to take it back now. God damn it, then tell him to take it to the homeless shelter. Champagne and caviar, sir. Just do it, he snapped, and slammed down the receiver. Slumping in his chair, Nicholson put his head in his hands, trying to think of a way out of the disaster. This can't be happening, he kept repeating. Would you mind telling me what in God's name is going on? Came a familiar voice. I had to walk all the way from the front gate to get up here. Appalled, the hairy director looked up into the florid face of his chairman of the board. Adrenaline shot through Grant's system as he desperately tried to think of some way to appease the angry man. Actually, Mr. Worthington, we've managed to avoid a disaster. When we uncovered problems with the Warhol, I knew you wouldn't want the celebration to go on. What do you mean a problem with the Warhol? The executive demanded, leaning toward Nicholson menacingly. Sir, it appears that the print is a fake, a forgery, sir. A fake? Worthington yelled. How in hell could you have accepted a fake? You people are supposed to be the art experts. Didn't you think to inspect it before turning on the PR machine and boasting to the world about your coup? I know how it looks, sir, but there was the matter of the will, and then we had to work with the security company to get it here. Sir, you should have seen all the security that old man had. Enough. Worthington thundered. The way it stands now, Birch Grove will be the laughing stock of the art world for years to come. And I think I speak for the board when I say you're the one responsible for this debacle. Consider yourself fired as of tonight. As soon as you can get through the god-awful traffic jam you've created out there, you need to exit these premises and never return. Before Nicholson could lodge a protest, Van Worthington turned and stamped away, not even looking at the cowering girl at the desk outside. Oh God, I'm ruined, the former executive director moaned. When this gets out, no museum in the country will hire me. As he sat wallowing in self-pity, his secretary suddenly appeared. Sir, there's a call for you, she said shakily. I told you, Nicholson snarled, no more phone calls. I'm sorry, Mr. Nicholson, but it's your wife. And she said to tell you if you don't talk to her, then don't bother coming home tonight. Nicholson was beaten. All right, put her through, he acquiesced. When the connection was made, there was no doubt in his mind just how angry Greta was. You'd better have a damned good explanation for this, Grant. I've been stuck out here in a traffic jam for God knows how long. People keep walking up and down the line of cars, and when they see me they want to know what's happening. And I, the wife of the executive director, am every bit as ignorant as they are. If you intended to humiliate me, you couldn't have picked a better way to do it. She paused to catch her breath. So what do you have to say for yourself? It's very simple, dear, Nicholson said calmly. As we were hanging the Warhol in the exhibition hall, we discovered that, well, that it's a fake. A fake? She cried. Of course we couldn't exhibit a forgery, so we had no choice but to cancel the showing. It's unfortunate that we didn't uncover the issue until the last minute. He paused, swallowed, and then decided to accept his fate. It's also unfortunate that in such situations someone has to be the scapegoat, whether it's their fault or not. Despite all I've done for Birch Grove, Van Worthington just relieved me of my responsibilities, effective immediately. She gasped. Worthington fired your ass. Oh my god, this really does take the cake. She took a deep breath. Listen, Grant, over the years I've put up with a lot from you, not the least of which was your sordid affair with that little tart you hired as development director. I've looked the other way too many times, but this is a bridge too far. Do not come home tonight or ever again, except to pick up your personal belongings. My attorney will be filing for divorce the first thing in the morning. Do you understand? He sighed the sigh of a beaten man. Do you understand? She repeated. Yes, dear. When he heard the call disconnect, he dropped his head to his desk, completely defeated. Paloma heard about the disastrous unveiling at Birch Grove and the firing of Grant Nicholson from Christina. When she rushed to tell Daniel, he greeted the news with satisfaction, but not surprise. I told you I'd get back at him for what he did to my marriage, he said. She looked at him quizzically. But how could you know this would happen? I didn't. Well, not exactly. But I set things up so it was likely he'd do himself in. He grinned. I couldn't know he'd do it in such a public and humiliating way, but I was pretty sure about the outcome, regardless. And after what he and Susan tried to do, I think he got exactly what he deserved. Now Paloma looked at him carefully. So what exactly did you do, Senor Daniel? I still don't understand. He smiled. Come with me to my office at the university. That way, I'll be able to show you. When they got to his cluttered office, he pulled up a chair for her before seating himself. Let's talk about Susan first, he said. As you know, her plan was to keep her affair with Nicholson a secret until my father's Parkinson's disease killed him. Dad was deteriorating fast, so she was pretty sure she wouldn't have to wait too long. She couldn't file before Dad passed away because she needed me to inherit his estate. That way she'd get half of everything. His house was valuable, but the real prize, of course, was his Warhol. I don't know what legal maneuver she was planning to pull, but her attorney was sure he could get the Warhol treated as communal property. After the settlement, she'd walk off with half the auction value, a lot of money. But you and your cousin found out about her affair, and when I learned what she and Grant were plotting, I went to talk with Dad. I knew his intent was to leave the Warhol to me. But after I heard Susan's plans, I urged him to leave the work to Birch Grove. Not only would it be safely out of her reach, but we could use the bequest as leverage against her. He smiled. And it worked. When Grant learned the only way Birch Grove could get the Warhol would be to cut all ties with my wife, he dropped Susan like a hot potato. Daniel grew pensive. I don't know whether Grant was truly in love with Susan, but I'm pretty sure she was just using him as another step up the social ladder. Whatever the case, she quickly learned how deep his commitment to her was. Once my father's will was read, she lost her job, her lover, and, of course, her marriage to me. Everything worked out just the way I hoped. By the way, the other day a friend told me Susan has moved to Allentown. He heard the only job she could find was working in a telemarketing center selling insurance. Instead of moving up the ladder, my ex-wife has fallen down considerably. That's probably the most painful punishment I could have wished for her. I can see how you got back at Susan, Paloma nodded, and in my opinion she got exactly what she deserved. Cheating on your husband is bad enough, but plotting to take advantage of you and your father, that is horrible, she said, using the Spanish pronunciation. But what about Nicholson? What did you do to him? He grinned. You know about what happened at Birch Grove last night, right? Well, some of it. Mainly I was just shocked to learn your father's artwork wasn't real. A sad look came to her eyes. In a way I'm glad Senor Morgan didn't have to hear that cruel news. Daniel looked at her appreciatively. It says so much that your first reaction is to think of my father. He got up from his seat. But don't be too sad for him. Reaching behind a filing cabinet, he pulled out a Marilyn Monroe teaching aid he used in his intro course, and laid it on the desk. She looked at him with uncertainty. A great writer once said that the best way to keep something safe is to hide it in plain sight. Let me show you something. He turned the print over so she could see the reverse side covered in brown paper. Carefully he peeled the paper back, revealing an inscription. To Ezra Morgan, for all his hard work. Andy Warhol. This is the real print. Paloma gasped. But it is the one you use in your classes. You told me about that and it's just sitting here in your office. Daniel smiled and nodded. But when did you make the swap? The other print was hanging in your father's living room long before Marco and I moved in. For that matter, it was long before you learned what Susan was planning. And with all the security Senor Morgan had, how could you have swapped it? Daniel grinned. At first, Dad never thought his print was worth that much. After all, Warhol sold his screen prints originally for only a few $100s each. But as his works grew in popularity, Dad began to worry about having a genuine artist's proof in his home. He and I discussed it, and I suggested we swap the real thing for a cheap print. I'd keep the real Warhol here and use it in my lectures, so no one would suspect it had any value. He would keep the reproduction on his living room wall. Later, as Warhol's value kept rising, Dad came up with the idea of having security installed to guard it. He figured no one would question the authenticity of a work protected by all those security measures. It became a game to him, always looking for more high-tech gadgets to protect it. Daniel smiled at Paloma. Fortunately, there never was a burglary attempt, but I'm sure all that security helped convince Nicholson he was getting the real thing. So you swapped the prints before I went to work for your father? That's right. I intended to swap the two back whenever Dad ultimately passed away. But after I learned about Grant and Susan, I saw a way to get back at both of them. After I talked with Dad that night, he had his attorney rewrite his will, so Nicholson would be sure to dump Susan. Then I let Grant take the fake Warhol, figuring he'd want to show off his prize as quickly and as publicly as possible. Sure enough, he took the bait. And just like Susan, he lost his job, his marriage and his reputation. So what happens now? My plan is to let all the commotion at Birch Grove die down. Once it does, I'll quietly notify the board that I found the real Warhol in the storage container I didn't know Dad had. After they've had a chance to verify its authenticity, I'll ask that it be hung with a plaque that memorializes my dad's connection to Warhol. Don't you feel bad about not having the Warhol for yourself? After all, it was very valuable. He smiled at her. Honestly, I don't feel bad at all. I never wanted the responsibility of owning an important work of art. And as for the money, it was Susan who craved wealth and status, not me. After what I saw that craving do to her, I'm just as happy that it will be off my hands. Then his smile grew even bigger. Besides, I hope doing all this will help me reach a more important goal. She stared at him uncertainly. What goal is that? To become part of a new family. What did you just say? What new family? Daniel stepped around the desk to take her hands in his. A new family with you, Marco and me. When the graduate student who'd come to see Professor Morgan saw the couple in each other's arms, she smiled and tiptoed away. Once she was well down the hall, she called a fellow student. Remember how we were so worried about Professor Morgan after he lost his dad and his wife? Well, I think our favorite prof is going to be okay. Well, that's it for today's story, my friends. Don't forget to like and subscribe before you leave, and I'll see you in the next video.